The Cold War is referred to as being cold because a hot war never broke out. Except that in reality, the Cold War saw a multitude of hot wars, resulting in millions of people being killed as a result. This chilly conflict had a tendency to flare up at frequent intervals, albeit in the form of proxy wars or localized conflicts in which both of the superpowers, as well as regional powers, would support opposing factions. 1962, however, saw an apparently simple bilateral border conflict between two regional powers bring about the paradoxical situation of the two superpowers supporting the same side against another communist state. I'm your host David, and this week we are going to look at the 1962 Sino-Indian War. This is the Cold War. If you're like me, you want to maximize the use of your precious free time. And for me, looking for a way to relax, it's playing the most comprehensive vehicle combat game ever made, War Thunder. War Thunder is great because it lets me play the game I want to. Sometimes that's a fast, action-packed game, and other times a more realistic and tactical PvP experience. This is possible through War Thunder's various immersion levels made to suit any playstyle. The historian in me loves the choice of vehicles spanning over 100 years from the 1920s to the present, meaning there are over 2,000 tanks, planes, helicopters, and ships to choose to take into dynamic, combined arms PvP battles. Find out why I love the B-29 and its ability to obliterate an enemy base. Thanks to the incredible detail, even down to individual vehicle components, and in 4K, War Thunder offers the highly immersive combat experience I know you'll love. You can play War Thunder for free on Xbox, PlayStation, or PC just by using our link in the description, and if you are a returning player that hasn't played in the last 6 months, our link lets you claim a large bonus pack. This lets you claim multiple premium vehicles, premium account, an exclusive 3D vehicle decorator, and much more, but is only available for a limited time, so click that link now. See you on the battlefield. The end of British colonial rule in India in 1947 left in its wake a number of questionable and therefore contended border lines, most notably and infamously the border with Pakistan. One of those other lines, however, was the McMahon Line, the de facto northeastern border between China and India, which, at least initially, caused less violence and displacement than in Pakistan, but would go on to cause its fair share of trouble. Upon independence, India declared the line as its official boundary with China, despite the fact that this border was never actually agreed on with either the Kuomintang or with Mao's communist faction. Nonetheless, initial relations between the two countries appeared cordial. The McMahon border was tacitly accepted, and the two nations drafted their 5 Principles of Peaceful Coexistence in 1954. Indian Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru even coined the slogan Hindi Chini Bye Bye, or Indians and Chinese are brothers. However, Sino-Indian relations began to sour at the end of the 1950s. The main bone of contention was Tibet. Keep in mind that Tibet dominated the majority of the territory along the border of the two countries, and for a time in the 1950s, Tibet considered itself to be independent due to a lack of control from Beijing. But after Mao occupied Tibet and then crushed an uprising in the region, Nehru's government was keen to offer asylum to Tibetan separatists, including the Dalai Lama in 1959. Beijing even accused Nehru of planning to turn Tibet into a demilitarized buffer zone, a move designed to carry forward a British imperial strategy. Another blow to Sino-Indian friendship had been dealt in late 1958. The Indian government discovered that China had developed a road on the Aksai Chin plateau, nestled in the western Himalayas, where the borders of China, India, and Pakistan meet. This tract of road was part of a larger plan to link Tibet and Xinjiang to eastern China. Thus, the plateau was of strategic importance to Beijing, but was equally important to Delhi. The Indians considered it theirs, as it had been claimed as part of Kashmir since 1865. China had been unable to dispute the claim due to the overall weakness of the Chinese state in the 19th century, combined with the region having been in a state of rebellion at the time the territory was claimed. Tensions escalated, flaring up in a clash on the Aksai Chin, resulting in the death of 9 Indian frontier guards. Both parties involved accused each other of refusing to hold reasonable negotiations. Nehru's idealistic vision of Hindi Chini bye-bye was gradually eroded by the realpolitik of border disputes and was eventually replaced by the aggressive forward policy in November 1961. This policy instructed Indian Army units to cross into Chinese territory and establish outposts to the rear of Chinese frontier troops, thus cutting off their supply lines. This strategy clearly angered Mao and his government, but the two nations would not yet come to blows. Before we get to that, we need to pause for a moment and consider the broader geopolitical context of the time, namely the influence of the Sino-Soviet split. By early 1962, the Communist Party of the Soviet Union and the Chinese Communist Party were no longer BFFs. Or maybe BIFFs? Best ideological friends forever? Anyway, Chairman Mao, like a lot of people, had overestimated the nuclear arsenal at the disposal of Premier Khrushchev, and thus urged him to lead the communist bloc into a more aggressive stance towards the US and the West. Khrushchev's strategy of peaceful coexistence, first with President Eisenhower, then with JFK, disappointed the Chinese hardliners, who described Moscow's approach as Soviet communism revisionism. The Soviets' reaction was to withdraw their massive military and civil assistance from China and offer support and assistance to Mao's rivals instead. In particular, Khrushchev was keen to strengthen ties with Nehru, who had been thus far a staunch member of the non-aligned movement alongside Tito and Nasser. Nikita, always looking for an angle by which to gain an advantage, sought to find a regional ally in South Asia to counterbalance American presence in Pakistan. Soviet military assistance to India became a tangible prospect in May 1962 with an offer to supply MiG-21 jet fighters, state-of-the-art at the time. Rumors of the MiG deal reached the ears of the American and British foreign policy and defense departments, setting alarms in motion. The Americans were worried about the contract as they had just sold a number of Lockheed F-104 starfighters to Pakistan and feared the onset of an arms race in the subcontinent. But what the US and the UK feared most was that the Soviets could gain access to Western military hardware in India. Nehru reassured London and Washington that he would put measures in place to prevent Soviet advisors from stealing Western technology, but President Kennedy still disapproved of the deal, venting the possibility that the US might cease to provide wheat exports to India. Eventually, all attempts to block the sale of the MiGs failed completely. Indian Minister of Defense Krishna Menon was decidedly pro-Soviet, and the terms of payment offered by Moscow were simply too advantageous. Besides, American attempts to hinder the deal had reached the ears of the Indian public, and Nehru could not risk losing face by backing down. Moreover, the British, under the influence of Commonwealth Relations Secretary Duncan Sandys, advised not to replace the Indian MiGs with hardware of their own, lest they jeopardize the West's good relationship with Pakistan. So, the MiGs were on their way to Delhi, correct? Well, not really, as the onset of the Cuban Missile Crisis threw the proverbial spanner into the works. We will cover this crisis in an upcoming episode, although I am sure that you are all familiar with the basics. But to give you some context, this crisis was sparked by the buildup of Soviet nuclear ballistic missiles in Cuba as a means to deter a US invasion and counterbalance American nuclear presence in Turkey and Italy. In October 1962, the two superpowers engaged in a tense staring contest, which brought the world to the brink of total nuclear war. This game of brinksmanship drew China and the Soviet Union closer after their previous disagreement. Mao appreciated Khrushchev's courage in playing hardball with the Americans, while Moscow needed Beijing's backing throughout the crisis. And to do so, Khrushchev was willing to betray his budding friendship with Nehru. So, in September and October 1962, the Soviet ambassador to India, Ivan Bednikov, met several times with his Chinese counterpart, Pan Zili, effectively resuming diplomatic contact. In early October, Chinese Premier Zhou Enlai summoned the Soviet ambassador in Beijing, Stepan Chervonenko, and briefed him about Nehru's forward policy and troop movements along the Sino-Indian border with its progressive encroachment on contested territory. Most importantly, Zhou asked Chervonenko if the Soviets were actually going to proceed with the sale of the MiG-21s. On October 13th, Khrushchev mirrored Zhou's actions and met with the Chinese ambassador in Moscow, Lu Xiao. The premier informed the diplomat that Moscow would support Beijing's protests against any Indian action. At a banquet the following day, he confirmed his position and reassured Liu that the MiGs would not be provided to the Indian Air Force. The premier then handed the baton to his foreign policy chief, Anastas Mikoyan, who kept Liu Xiao informed of the Soviet nuclear deployment to Cuba. As if by magic, Chinese propaganda against Soviet revisionism fell immediately out of fashion. Funny how that works. The battle lines were thus drawn. The Soviets and the Americans had their hands full with tense negotiations over the Cuban missiles, the Soviets and the Chinese were good buddies once more, and Nehru realized that his order of MiGs was indefinitely suspended. This left him in an unsustainably weak position as his troops in the contested border were outnumbered and outgunned by the Chinese, as well as ill-equipped for mountain warfare. The official start date of hostilities in the 1962 war is set as October 20th, 1962. This is when the Chinese launched an attack interpreted by India and the West as a Chinese aggression. Beijing had other views, dubbing it counterattack in self-defense on the China-India border. And they may have had a point. You see, as early as June, Indian forces had pushed north of the McMahon Line, establishing the Dola Post on Thagla Ridge. On September 8, 1962, the post was surrounded by a Chinese detachment, intimidating the Indians to surrender. In response, Indian troops received the directive, quote, to fire on any armed Chinese who entered Indian territory. Standoffs escalated into skirmishes, which eventually erupted into the October 20th Chinese attack directed against Ladakh in Northeast Frontier Agency, or NEFA. Despite the heroic resistance of Gurkha units, the Indians were outnumbered 4-1 by the Chinese and were soon routed. Prime Minister Nehru's only choice was to seek help from the US and the UK. President Kennedy and Prime Minister Harold Macmillan agreed that they had a unique opportunity in their hands. India had veered away from its stance on non-alignment and into the Soviet camp, but could now be brought back towards the Western fold. Despite dedicating almost all his time to the Cuban crisis, Kennedy took a keen interest in the Indian situation to the point of risking his alliance with Pakistan. JFK's administration feared that China would soon develop its own nuclear arsenal, and a strong India would help keep it in check, even better if armed with nuclear teeth of its own. As a result, Kennedy and Macmillan ordered a massive airlift to provide Nehru with weapons and other supplies. The American president also intervened with Pakistan, who was ready to exploit India's weakness and seize the disputed region of Kashmir. Kennedy made it clear that he would regard any action in Kashmir as a direct act of war. The Pakistanis backed down. Western support was not little, but it was also not enough, and it was certainly too late. In November, the Chinese launched a second offensive, crushing the Indians in the Nifa area and threatened to drive as far as the Bay of Bengal. On November 19th, Nehru issued a second appeal to Kennedy, urgently demanding some serious hardware: 12 squadrons of fighter jets, 2 squadrons of B-47 bombers, 10,000 crewmen, and the construction of a radar shield. Moreover, Nehru asked for these American reinforcements to take a direct role in the fight and to bomb Chinese cities. Before Kennedy could answer Nehru's letter, Mao announced a unilateral ceasefire on November 21st. The brief war had been a clear operational victory for China's military, which had inflicted some 9,000 casualties to the enemy while suffering 2,400 losses. China had also annexed 15,000 square miles of the Aksai Chin area, even if the pre-war Sino-Indian border in the Nefa region remained mostly the same. So, what caused the sudden halt in fighting? Well, the reason for Mao's sudden ceasefire can be found thousands of miles away from Aksai Chin in the Caribbean basin, more precisely in Cuba. As you may guess from the fact that I'm not speaking to you from Vault 21, the missile crisis was settled peacefully. Khrushchev agreed to remove his weapons from Cuba, and the Americans reciprocated by dismantling their launch pads in Turkey and Italy. But since the American part of the deal was not made public, Khrushchev looked weak, which infuriated Mao. China resumed the virulent campaign against the revisionists and capitulationists in Moscow. Funny how that works. In the first weeks of November, the Soviet premier had had enough of Mao's trolling and informed Nehru that he would resume the MiG-21 deal. Mao realized that Nehru would soon receive some serious air support from both the US and the USSR. That's right, the unprecedented event of two arch-enemies joining forces against another big Cold War player. Wisely, Mao ordered a progressive withdrawal from the theater of operations and eventually ceased hostilities while still holding a position of strength. The ceasefire denied Khrushchev an opportunity to blast at Mao with his jet fighters, even if it would have been in true Cold War fashion, by proxy. But he did not miss the opportunity to unleash a verbal barrage in a speech given on December 12th. In front of the Supreme Soviet, the premier accused the Chinese for their wrongful aggression against India and for their opportunistic stance during the Cuban crisis. Mao responded in kind, launching a new propaganda campaign against Moscow's phony communism, the 9 commentaries, which only helped to widen the Sino-Soviet chasm. After the war, Nehru realized his mistake in underestimating Chinese military reactions to provocations on their border. The defeat of 1962 prompted the Prime Minister to resume a policy of peaceful negotiations, even if further skirmishes continue to occur even to the present day. The outcome of the war also prompted the US and the UK to revise their policy towards India. From then on, Delhi would continue to maintain its non-aligned stance whilst gravitating towards Soviet friendship. Nonetheless, the West attempted to counterbalance this shift by increasing promises of economic aid to India. And as for China, well, it may have enjoyed a military victory, but the country suffered from a negative backlash in terms of its international image. Mao was universally perceived as the aggressor, and its regime suffered from progressive isolation even within the communist sphere. Ironically, it was this isolation which later would be the impetus for the rapprochement with Nixon and Kissinger in the following decade. But Nixon going to China will be looked at in future episodes. This video is sponsored by the military online game War Thunder. Make sure to check out the link in the description to join us on the battlefield. To make sure you don't miss our future videos about the history of the Cold War, by proxy or otherwise, make sure to encroach on the like button, surround that revisionist subscribe, and deploy 10,000 airborne infantry on the bell button. A huge thank you to all of our Patreon patrons, and if you aren't already, please consider supporting us on Patreon at patreon.com/thecoldwar or through YouTube membership. We can be reached via email at thecoldwarchannel@gmail.com. This is the Cold War Channel, and as we think about the Cold War, please remember that history is shades of gray and rarely black and white.